Hello, welcome to Cozy Costume Creations. I'm Sarah Beth, and today I'm going to walk you through how to do a pancake tutu using the McCall's Costumes M7615 pattern. Before we get started, there are two things I would advise when doing this pattern to change that I would have liked to have known ahead of time and done. One of them is that for contrast fabric 1, which is what you use for the panties, which is what, the base that all these gathered pieces of tulle are sewn onto, it just says that you should have cotton and cotton blends as the fabric. And first of all, patterns shouldn't give you just a fiber because a fiber can be used to make so many different types of textiles. If you're going to recommend a fabric, you should have a fiber and a textile, or if you're going to choose just a textile or like a weave, do that. So this I did cotton, and I did 100% cotton, just a plain weave. It had a little bit more stretch than I would have liked, so I think if I were to make this again in the future, I would use cotillo as the base instead, and that would give me a lot nicer structure, and I think it'd be way easier to sew. So that's what I would recommend. You just want something that's like a little bit heavier, has just a weave that's stiffer, and it has that structure. So I would have done that, I think. The other thing is that it has you sewing this on at 3/8 of an inch. So the ruffles are like gathered and sewn on at about 3/8 of an inch. And I think that seam allowance is just, it's hard to do. So I think what I would do is I would do it at a 5/8 of an inch, and if you need to clip it down afterwards, great, but I think sewing at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to do the gathers and to sew it on will make your life probably easier. That one I'm a little bit like, I can see how there are some things that make it harder, but I mean, I think if you sewed it on at 5/8 and then cut it down to 3/8, I think your life would be a lot easier. So those are two initial recommendations I have after having done this pattern. Also, I'm just going to show you how to do the tutu. I'm not doing the rest of that because those are just bodices and you can do those all the time. So yeah, let's get started. One other recommendation I have for you is that you should wear long sleeves. And I knew that coming in because all this rough tulle going through the machine, it really does scratch up. So I knew that going in, but I think I wore ones that were like a little bit baggier as I was doing it, and I think like a tighter fit would have been more comfortable, and I kind of did that in the end. So something like this I think is going to be better because all of this scratchy tulle up against your skin, these lower layers didn't matter as much. Like they were just like, they're shorter, didn't really scratch up, but especially these later, longer layers, they kind of hurt. So I took breaks in between. Actually, I did most of these, and these final two I did separately just because my arms were like kind of scratched up, and I was like, I'm gonna let these heal a little bit and like settle down. So it is scratchy. It is kind of painful, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so wear some long sleeves, and I don't know, I also like had my safety glasses nearby because of just the thickness of some of the tulle going through. Yeah. But yeah, so this is a pancake tutu, and it really is, like, theoretically I knew how to make these before, but now I actually did one, so yay. And what I'd heard before is it's just layers of tulle. They start off small and then they just kind of build and stack on top of each other. And as you can see, that's really what it is. This is the longest layer, slightly shorter, slightly shorter, slightly shorter, slightly shorter, until we go down to these like little tiny ones at the bottom, right? So it's just layers layered on top of each other and gathered. And yeah, this has gotten some, like, quite a bit of poof, which is like kind of rad, because one of the other secrets that I didn't know before is that you kind of switch the direction of your seam allowance so that it pushes the tulle in different directions, which is kind of cool. So here we go. Let's go for it. It is a wild ride. Let's do it.
Alright, so the first step obviously is to cut out all of the pieces. So I went ahead and I cut out the panties first, and here I am tracing all of these lines, right? So there's all these lines on the pattern, and those are placement lines for each of the different layers of tulle, right? So they're very important. And so what I'm doing is I've got my tracing paper. I prefer the waxy tracing paper, I prefer the chalky to the waxy ones. Some are a little bit more waxy, and then you get like wax that's transferred onto your garment, and especially with like a tutu where it's gonna be really hard to launder and to reach that later, I really just don't think wax is a great option. So this is a chalk transfer paper. I also like these because, you know, they stain less than the wax tracing paper typically does. So what I've got is I've got 2 layers of it, so that the 2 layers of the panty are each getting the lines traced onto them. And of course I'm using my tracing wheel here to do that. And yeah, so now you can see I've got all of my lines transferred. Look at that, look at that. And you can kind of see just like the placement of each of these lines. So here's a little close up. Here's the other side, so I did both at the same time. One's a little lighter because I didn't have the exact same shade of blue for each of them, and that's fine. So then you have so many layers of tulle to gather for this. So this is me gathering the first layer and then stitching it to the panty. So this one, it has like a thin layer of, not thin, just like a not wide, I guess that is thin, a thin layer of tulle that you stitch onto kind of like the thigh holes, which is actually really uncomfortable. I don't know if that is a normal ballet thing. Ballet is not my expertise. I typically work in theater, opera, and other types of dance. I've done a lot of like cultural dance work. So this is a little different from what I typically do. So I'm not sure if that's normal or not, but I have to tell you, it is uncomfortable. I mean, look at that. There's like a layer of of like scratchy tulle right up against like, ugh. Anyway, I don't like that positioning at all. But I did it for this pattern. I don't think I would do it again unless that's like a normal ballet thing. I just feel like that is really uncomfortable. I put it on afterwards too, and I was like, this is not comfortable. All right, so the next thing we're doing is it actually has single fold bias tape. I generally prefer double fold. I just really, really like double fold, but single fold is sufficient for what they want you to do. So you're just going around that like thigh hole. And you're stitching it in place first, right? So you stitch the first layer down of the bias tape, single fold bias tape, and you stitch it down in like the placement of the first fold kind of thing. So there I am, I'm stitching it. Yay. And then you do this, of course, for both sides, right? I also left my bias tape attached, and I don't cut my bias tape until after I've stitched that, just because it does have some stretch and you can conserve a bit of fabric when you do that, because usually it'll stretch around it a little bit more and you'll have a little extra. And then if you keep it attached to the main roll, then you're saving that for a future project instead of having like an extra inch that you have to throw away. So then, of course, half of sewing is ironing, right? Rule number 1. So, of course, we're going to go through and iron everything first. And then we're going to do the little flippy flip and iron it that way. So you flip the bias tape, and then we're going to iron on the seam that we adjusted, kind of ironing it towards yourself and towards the opening, right? So we're going to iron that down. Yes, good. All right, now we're going to do another flip-a-rooney. So you can see, this is the single fold bias tape. You have one fold there, and then another fold, so that you have a finished edge on the inside, and then you just kind of fold it along the edge that has the gathered tulle. And you can just kind of fold it really nicely, make it really crisp. Awesome. So now we're going to pin it. And again, the goal is that we're going to have a piece of elastic that's going to go through this, right? So we're obviously not going to stitch the ends down because you need to leave the ends open for the elastic to be fed through, right? And you also don't want to stitch like in the middle or too close, too far in. You want to stitch this down pretty close to the edge of the bias tape so that you have enough room for the elastic to go through, and because then you make it pretty and has a consistent the stitching is a consistent distance from the edge, which is just good craftsmanship, right? Yeah, so we're getting like beautiful finished edges on both sides by doing this, which is one of the advantages of bias tape, is it just gives you like nice, really clean, finished, beautiful edges. Bias tape, it's so good, it's so good. And yeah, so this is a single fold bias tape, and this is a technique that's often used with it to finish edges. So you could do the same thing on like an arm side or a neckline. You use it lots and lots of places to give yourself a finished edge, but then you don't have, like sometimes I'll use double fold bias tape to have a more decorative edge. So you see like maybe I'd have a contrasting color, and then you'd have like a different, like a color of a different strip on the edge, right? With the single fold though, it just, is nice and easy, goes on the inside, and nobody knows it's even there. So this is a good technique to learn for lots and lots of things because you use this often. I do like though that you have the tool here because you can kind of pull it, and that makes it so that your edge is just a little bit cleaner. So that's one advantage to having that very scratchy layer of tulle right around your thigh. All right. Let's take a look-see. This is what it looks like on the inside, and here it looks on the outside. Again, it's a really nice finishing technique. So now I'm going to stitch it down, and again, I'm trying to stitch like, I'm not stitching in the middle of this. First of all, that'd be bad craftsmanship. Second of all, that wouldn't leave room for my elastic, right? So I'm giving myself enough distance on the edge. What I could have done too is I could have done this and stitched it from the inside and used my favorite foot, the number 5 foot, and had that right up against the edge of the bias tape, and stitched an equal distance from there. And that would have been an equally good way to do this. That would have given me, also a beautiful edge. So that's 2 ways you could have done this, right? Look at that. Lovely, lovely, lovely. So this is what it looks like up close, where we've got that nice, beautiful finished edge. And of course, it doesn't look as fantastic as it could right now because it needs to be ironed first. Because half of sewing is ironing. So yeah, so then we iron it. And then of course you do that to both sides. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put the 2 parts of the panty together so that we have our full panty, I guess. We've only been working with half so far, right? So we're going to put it together, right? And what we're stitching up is we're stitching up center front and center back. So this one right here is center back because you're going to get in and out of it with center back having the opening. So it has a marking on the pattern of where you stop the stitching up to, and that's what my first pin indicates. That's where that stitching stops, right? And then, so that part is left open, and we're going to finish that in a second with a slip stitch, but for the time being, we leave that open, right? And then center front, the whole seam is stitched from top to bottom, right? So, of course, first we're going to pin those in place, and then we're going to stitch them up, and then press them, and then press those seams open, right? As always. I did think this was a bit odd when I got this pattern of having these be 2 separate pieces, because they could have had you like cut on fold for center front and just had the opening in the back. I don't think it's a bad choice what they did. I just haven't seen like a panty pattern quite. Usually the seams are the side seams, but it makes sense for this because they want a back opening. So a little different than usual, but not bad, and makes sense for what they're doing. So good for them. So here's what we have. We have an opening as center back, you see. And it's stitched up the rest of the way though, and then center front fully stitched up. All right. So of course, first I pressed my stitches the way that they were sewn, then I press them open, and then this is the weird thing it wants you to do. So it wants you to finish this top part. It's not a weird thing, it's just It's just the thing it wants you to do. So what we're going to do is a slip stitch. So what I've done is I've folded under 1/4 of an inch and then folded it again. So we have a beautiful finished folded edge, right? That is a total of about 1/4 of an inch wide. So that's what we're doing. A slip stitch is a type of stitch that is worked only with folded edges. So if you haven't seen this stitch before, here's a great place to learn. This one is a super common stitch. You use it a lot for hems, actually, and a lot of other things. I use this stitch and whip stitch probably the most out of any stitch. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a single thread of the fabric, right? A single thread, and then I go in between the folded edge, right? So I go in between the folded edge for about 1/4 of an inch. I come out, and then the main fabric, the not folded edge part, I grab a single thread of the weave. And that sometimes takes a second to grab it, but you really just want a single thread, and that's what makes it look invisible and beautiful and nice. So yeah, a little closer up, you can see I'm working the fabric to just grab a single thread, right? And it's right next to it, and then I go right back in, really close to where I came out of the folded edge to begin with. And I go back through the fold. Bloop, bloop. Sorry, my camera isn't adjusting as well. There, I can see a little better. All right, so yeah, grabbing a single thread, and then I go back in right so close to where I came out of the fabric in the first place, and then I stay in the fold for about 1/4 of an inch. I'm doing a little bit less here. And then again, I grab just a single thread really close to where I came out of the fabric, going back into that fold, close to where I came out in the first place, go for 1/4 of an inch-ish, grabbing a single thread of the main fabric right close to that edge, going back in into that fold, right? So that's a slip stitch. This is a slip stitch. Very, very common hand stitching. You notice also I'm using a single thread, right? This is not a double thread technique. This is a single thread because the goal is to make it as invisible as possible. So we're valuing invisibility over strength here, hence single thread rather than double, right? I'm also using silicone thread, which is my favorite because it's a wax thread that is designed for hand sewing to make hand sewing so flowy and nice and beautiful and not as knotty as other types, right? You're just less likely to knot yourself because of that beautiful waxed thread. Delicious. Anyway, huge fan of silicone. It's the thing. Buy it at wawac.com. Don't buy it other places because they will charge you up the wazoo. Anyway, yes. So we're going to do that for both sides, right? So I do that on the one side, and then I swap over and do the other side as well. And again, slip stitching used really commonly, very, very often as a finishing or hemming technique. So let's take a look up close. Up close, you can see there's just like tiny little pinpricks of where I came out, grabbed the thread. And then on the opposite side, again, you see virtually nothing. You see that single thread that I picked up, right? In those few places. So you see just like those pinpricks of those few places where a single thread was grabbed, and that's it. You see nothing else. Whew. All right, moving on. No rest for the weary, y'all. So we have all of this tulle that we have to gather. Gather stitching is usually done by machine. You can do it by hand, but you're using a basting stitch, right? So a basting stitch is a long stitch length. I think I'm using a 4 here, a 4 stitch length. Anywhere between like a 4 and a 6 is usually a normal like basting stitch length, or a gather stitch length. Some machines go up to a 9. I don't think I've seen any machines that go longer than a 9 stitch length. So 9 is typically the longest. But so basically 4 plus is a gather or basting stitch, right? So you have a very long stitch length, and that makes it so that you can gather this, right? Because you're going to pull those threads later, and that's what creates a gather, and that's what gives you that ruffly look, right? There are many ways to achieve like a ruffle look, but gather is a very common way to do it, right? So that's what this technique is. And here are all the pieces because there are a million pieces. One other thing I should note is that I cut these as like single strands. Like it had you be like, here's this piece, cut 6 of these. And I was like, or I could just not do seams and cut them the full length of it. So that's what I did. And so I don't have any seams, because if you're using a sheer fabric, it means you have to do French seams, and that's a lot of French seams. And so instead I just cut these as like long strips. So instead of like cutting, you know, piece like 25 like 3 times, I cut it as one strip that was 3 times the length of the one piece, right? I hope that makes sense. And that way I dodge some work. And I think it also makes it look prettier if it doesn't have those seams in there. So I think it looks better. I think it's better craftsmanship. And it was easier, so that's what I did. So the first 3 pieces are sewn only to center back. So what I do is I pin the edges first, and then I kind of fold the piece of tulle in half and have that halfway point, and I pin it to center back. And that way I can spread my gathers out a little bit more evenly than I pin.
Alright, I've pinned piece 21 in place, and it just doesn't have very many gathers. So it says cut 2, right? However, here there's no mention of sewing them together or layering the 2 pieces on top of each other. It just has 21, 22, 23, right? There's no seams, there's no nothing. And then it has you attach them. Based on the picture, it looks like there's way more gathers too. So my best bet is that this is a misprint, and it's probably cut 1 on fold. That way we're going to get more gathers, which is what you want for a tutu anyway. So that's my bet. I'm going to move forward with just 1 layer of 21, 22, and 23, because that's what I've got. And yeah, so I'm just going to do that. But I think for future, what I would do is I would just cut 1 on fold of each of those, because I think that's going to give you more of the look they're actually going for. We'll never know what that misprint was meant to be, but that's my best guess.
Yeah, so they either meant, you know, cut 1 on fold or stitch the 2 together or something else. But oh well. Moving forward. So I've got my next piece, and I'm lining it up with the lines that I drew on with my tracing wheel, right? And I pin the edges first, so 1 edge, and then I go over to the other side and get the other edge of the tulle, doop doop, and pin each of the edges in place first. And then I kind of fold it in half, get that halfway point, and then the halfway point on the fabric would be at center back, right? So then I match that up, pin that in place, and then I gather in between. So, of course, the way you gather is that you grab one of the threads and pull it, right? And then you can tie off once you've pulled it to the length that it needs to be, right? And then you pin in between. And of course, after you pin, you pull the threads. I prefer to pull the bobbin thread. It's a little smoother. And then you stitch it on after you spread them all out nice and evenly. Now we're going to do again with the other layer. And then that's all 3. So you do that. There it is. It's all pinned. I have special ways for making the... I have just a few techniques that I use for making my gathers even, which I don't think I've shown you guys before, but for my beginning class, I have a pattern I made of a petticoat that has a ruffle, and it's a gathered skirt, and it's got some grow tucks. It's got some really good techniques for them to learn, so that's a good one, and maybe I'll do a video of that sometime soon, and share that with you. But yeah, on to the next piece, and this is the first one to go all the way around. So 22, or 21, 22, 23, those all are just kind of at center back, and then this one goes all the way around. So you pin the 2 cut edges to the back, so those go at center back, and then of course you want to fold your long piece of tulle in half, and you get your halfway point, and then you pin that to center front, to that seam, right? And then you take the amount that is in between center back and center front on either side, and you get the halfway point there, and then also you have a matching halfway point that you make on or I think it might be marked on the panty, and then you match those up, and then this is how you gather. So I've pulled the thread, see I'm pulling it, and then I spread the fabric, right? And that's what creates the gathers. So I spread it and I pull until that large amount of fabric is gathered down to just the length of the panty, and then I pin it in place. And we're gonna do that a million times. So there you go. You might already know how to gather. It's just gathering, but if you didn't, there you go. New technique that is used all the time, everywhere. Alright, so real quick, the pattern has you basting these in place. It says baste everything and then stitch it down. You're going to have a really hard time if you do that. The reason is you need to use a longer stitch length for this like bulk of fabric to go through the machine without it like making really, really tiny stitches. So I ended up increasing my stitch length, and I think by the end, I think I was doing like a 4 or a 4.5 stitch length, which is normally a basting stitch, but because of the bulk of fabric, you kind of have to do a really long stitch length for this to like even work, at least with my machine. So I skipped the step of basting because I'm basically doing a basting stitch to stitch it on in the first place. I think it'd also be really hard to baste all of this and then sew it. Like, that's a lot of work. Good, basting is good to like put something in place so you can get it like precise and right, and then like, like technically they're not wrong. Like, that's a good technique to do, but in this case I think I would not do that. Alright, so this one, I'm doing the same thing where I match up the ends, I find my halfway points, and I pin. This piece is different from all of the other pieces we have done so far though, because this is the first piece that we are pinning the opposite direction that we have before. Before, the seam allowance is facing up towards the ceiling. If I were to be wearing this garment, my seam allowances are facing up towards the ceiling. This is the first layer where it's flipped. Now my seam allowance is facing towards the floor, and the bulk of my layer is facing up. So this is the special secret technique for tutu making that makes it so that the tutu sits out, right? It's really hard to get fabric to defy gravity, and this is one of those techniques that makes it defy gravity, right? So we flip this layer and we stitch it in place. I'm going to take a quick second to define some terms. Normal stitch length is usually between a 2 and a 3. 3 to a 4 is usually ease stitching. 4 plus is usually like a gather stitching or a basting stitch. A 1 to a 2 is usually used for reinforcement stitching, and you usually don't use a 0 to a 1 pretty much at all. So those are the different lengths of stitching, and they're each used for different things. The basting is used for gathering and for basting and lots of other things. Normal stitch length is just like normal sewing, you want it to stay in place. We'll talk about the others a different time. Alrighty, so here we have this layer stitched on. Got a pin stuck in there still. But yeah, so you can see it is going the opposite direction of the others now. It's defying gravity! Anyway, it's fine. So there it is. Yay, yay, yay. That's that layer. On to the next one. So here we have our next layer. And again, divide, pin, conquer. Veni, vidi, soi. Alright, so this one is also a layer that defies gravity. So once again, we're going to pin it the opposite direction. So it is facing up. And then like we got the underwear straps, you can see going the opposite way, right? So this is another layer that defies gravity. So then we stitch this one in place as well. And the more layers you get in there, the harder it freaking is to do it, which is also, this is one of the reasons why I'm like, you know what, if those seams were 5/8 of an inch, you could kind of stack them on top of each other a little bit easier. And I think that would make the sewing experience better. I also was thinking that if I did have like a stiffer fabric underneath, I might be able to use a normal stitch length instead of a longer stitch length. So that could be also the fabric of like having something that works with the thing you want it to do would make it easier. This is also, I'm gonna go, I don't want to go on a long rant about this, but this is also why like fabric selection is so important, why designers and manufacturers need to be really thoughtful about the fabrics that they suggest, because the fabric is what is going to determine whether it fights you the whole way or it like supports the whole thing that you're doing. All right, another layer. This is yet again a layer that defies gravity. So you have layer 25, 26, and 27 that are all defying gravity, right? You can see again, like, it's pushing itself up. And you can't even see the pins because there's so many layers of fabric at this point. But yeah, so those 3 layers all face, the seam allowance faces the floor, the bulk of it faces the ceiling, right? For those 3 layers. And this is what makes it so that it's gonna poof up, right? And eventually straight out. All right, so I ended up lifting my presser foot up a lot to make this all go through. And at this point, I was like, this is really bulky. I'm scared about this going through. So I put on my safety glasses because with this much bulk going through, I worry about breaking a needle. So here we have it. Now we have all of these layers stacked on top of each other. This thing is a monster. Look at that. And it's looking more and more like a tutu. So now we have piece 28. And this piece does not defy gravity. This piece goes with gravity, but we do have to do a little something. So what I do is I pull the basting stitch off of the first 5/8 of an inch, and then I fold it over, because this piece is going to have a bit of a seam at the bottom, and it is folded over. So this has a folded edge at center back on both sides. So I pull out the basting stitch so it'll make it a little bit easier for me to gather, and you don't want your seam allowance to be gathered. That just makes things messy. So I pulled that thread out for that like 5/8 of an inch along that edge, flipped it, and pinned it right along the edge and where this line number, whichever number of line I'm on, matches up, right? And I pinned it in place, and it's got that fold.
Oh my goodness. Okay. This is so much.
This is the point in the garment where I was like, oh man, this is getting brutal. This is a lot. This is a lot to fit through, and this is where I started to be like, this is a freaking workout. This is why I have such big muscles. This is it. Oh my gosh. Oof. There are so many layers. It's turning into a tutu.
We're getting there. We are getting there.
We're almost done. 2 more pieces, so we have 29. And this is a piece that defies gravity, and it has the fold over that we just did for 28. So we fold over the first 5/8 of an inch at center back, those side seams, and then we pin it to defy gravity. So, you know, the bulk of it is sticking up towards the heavens. You can see it pinned in place in the middle of all of that tulle.
Okay. Only 2 more layers. I can do this. Oh my goodness.
I love to sew. I really, really do. This was one where I was like, oh! You know, you always get that point in a project, even if you're in the middle of it and you absolutely love it and stuff. Every now and then there's a project where you're like halfway through, you're like, and that hasn't happened to me in actually a really, really long time. But it happened with this. Tutus really are brutal, and it might be partially because I have strained tendons in both of my hands, and so it really was actually a monster to push that through the machine. Like, afterwards I was like, oh, my muscles! It really was a workout. Alright, enough drama. We're almost there. We're almost there. Look at this. It's looking like a thing. We got these layers at the bottom, and they just stack, and another layer, another one, and another one, and another one, and we're getting a tutu-like thing, and another. Oh my goodness, we're almost there. It's great. It's great. Time for piece 30. Aw, yeah. That's right. Time to go. Alright, piece 30. So it does not defy gravity, and it does have the seam allowance, right? So you have to do the fold over of the 5/8 on either side. And then this piece 30, piece 29 and 28, you do a seam up from the bottom. So like the outside, the outskirts of the skirt, you're going to stitch that up along that seam for a little bit, but then leave an opening so that you can get it off, right? So that's the purpose of that. I don't think I showed that, but that's the thing that you do. So that's what happens there. Piece 30 in the pattern, you have 3 layers of them, and you stack them on top of each other. That was a lot. You'll see how poofy my tutu ends up being, and I was like, no, this doesn't need that many layers. So what I did is for the final layer, I made it twice as long as one piece would be, and then I just stitched that one in place, and that was it, because it was going to be just so excessively poofy with another layer that I didn't feel I needed it. Because, I mean, look at this. Here it is. Look at this tutu. Look at that. Floof and floof and floof. You could do all 3 layers. You totally could. I also think with the plain weave fabric, that's like really hard. I think if I had a coutil, like a stiffer fabric, totally could have gotten all 3 layers in. It probably would have been fine. And, you know, still like very, very poofy. But there you go. All right. Next step is feeding elastic through your thigh holes. All right. We're doing the elastic. Also, sorry guys, being a pattern maker, you're just like every step you're like, I would do this different, I would do that different, I would do that. So sorry about that. This is why most of the time I make my own patterns. But McCall's has some really awesome patterns, and I'm definitely a fan. And also this is my first tutu, so it's always good to like do someone else's, even if you would do it differently, to know what you would do differently. So for me, I'm feeding the elastic through here, and of course you attach a safety pin to the end and then feed it through. And this is 1/4 inch elastic. For me, because I'm a picky little butt, I really would prefer like a 1/2 inch elastic to the 1/4 inch, because 1/2 inch is just like thicker and stronger. And, you know, the thinner the elastic, like the less strong it is and the more kind of like stretchy and less like meh. So I prefer to use thicker elastics when I can. So for me, I would have preferred a 1/2 inch elastic. So I think I would have done the bias tape a little bit longer. But anyway, I stuck it in, and right here what I'm doing is a zigzag stitch, because we always zigzag whenever we use elastics, right? Whenever I use stretch, you want to use a zigzag stitch. The reason is then it can stretch without breaking the stitch, because if you do a straight stitch, the stretch of the stretch can break your stitches. So stretch is a whole area of techniques, and I can show you guys some of that sometime. I've done swimsuits, I've done lots of stuff with stretch. So again, I've done lots of other dance wear, just not tutus, and dance typically has a lot of stretch. So I'll show you guys that sometime. But anyway, so I zigzagged them at the very ends to keep them in place, using zigzag stitch because stretch, and so I did those on each end. Now what I'm doing is I'm pinning the center seams, the center back seam and the center front seam of the crotch circle. So this is the crotch that we're stitching up, and I'm pinning those in place. I go exactly through the seam to the other seam on the other side, and then through that and through it, right? So that way you can have pieces that match beautifully together, and one seam just blends seamlessly into the other. And that is good craftsmanship. So you pin that, and then you pin the rest of it, and then it's just a straight stitch, right? Straight stitch, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching along this crotch, right? This is the middle of the crotch. Then it has you do some extra steps. And obviously this is happening on the inside of the garment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take one of the sides of the seam allowance and I'm going to cut it down to 1/4 of an inch. This is a beautiful finishing technique that the pattern has you do so that you don't have scratchy seam up against your crotch, right? So we're going to finish this edge nicely. So I fold the other edge so that the top of it meets where the seam is, right? So then I fold it nicely in like this, boo, 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 boo. Fold this side so it touches the seam, and then fold it over again. And then I have a beautiful finished edge. It's just this nice fold. So then I'm going to pin it, and I'm going to stitch it down like that. So it's going to look kind of like a flat felled seam. And that is our last step. Pin that, stitch that, done.
All right, so we finished the tutu, and there are other parts to this pattern if you want to do the whole thing. I'm just doing this for my class though. But here we go. It's a tutu. It's finally done. Ugh. So there we go.
So, as always, I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. I did. This was an experiment for me. This is not my usual area, so thanks for joining me with my experimentation. And yeah, I hope you had fun. Hope you learned some stuff. And I hope when you hit a wall and you're like, oh no, this is a mess, that you keep going, because at the end, then you're like, okay, this was actually really awesome. So, if things get hard, it's okay. Have a little bit of resilience and perseverance, and you'll come out of it being like, man, that was awesome. So yeah, hope you had fun. See you later.